welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely fascinating and riveting and a whole lot of fun genre mashup, I'm going to say. There's a lot of genres going on in this book. I'd say there's sci-fi and there's fantasy. There's a scotch of horror, even, I would say, in this one. And I am so excited to talk about it. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello. Yes, my name is Thomas Elrod, and I'm the author of The Franchise, which, as you said, is a sort of sci-fi fantasy mashup about a Hollywood film studio that is running a fantasy film franchise for many years and decides to set up a living set where the movie becomes real.
That concept sold me immediately when this book hit my inbox. It intersects with so many interesting conversations, I think, about sci-fi and fantasy and about Hollywood and how we treat sort of intellectual property and all these kind of things. Before we get into the novel itself, I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about your career, your journey as a writer, and perhaps some of your other writing.
This is my first novel, and although I've written some reviews and criticism stuff, I haven't published fiction before. I've been writing my whole life, but really only, I'd say, in the last couple of years have I kind of gotten serious about publishing it. And I am, excited to do so, but this is sort of a new thing for me.
Hmm.
Yeah.
You have written a little bit of online stuff, is that correct? But
Yeah.
so when did this novel start then in that process? And what was the inception point? Was it the fantasy world you wanted to explore, a particular character you imagined, or where did it all start?
I think it started with the concept, and which really came out of frustration, probably with my own watching and reading of various IP franchises that are still ongoing in our culture. I mean, everyone knows, right, that like everything feels like it's just reboots and reimaginings and extensions of stuff that has been going on for years and years, and not necessarily for story reasons, just because that's where the business is at. And I think the experiment was, how long will these keep going? Because it feels like they will never end. And the idea of the studios getting to a point where they're making these things real. I mean, there was a Star Wars hotel for a short period of time in Disney World, which I found really interesting, where you could go to this hotel for 2 nights and live out a Star Wars adventure. Didn't really work, but it seemed like that kind of concept is kind of like taking people into these franchises that they're interested in. You know, you add a couple science fictional elements to it, and then you have something like the Truman Show, and it's not, and so that's really where it came from.
Yeah. Gosh, I watched a really interesting 4-hour YouTube video dissecting the Star Wars hotel. I think it was Jenny Nicholson, I think.
I watched that too. It was I don't usually watch these very long YouTube, but it was absolutely fascinating because I think a lot of the, same things is just like yeah, the amount of, and this is true, I think if you ever go to any like Disney World, Universal theme park, the amount of logistics that are involved with it and all these things are really interesting to me, because just from a purely technical point of view, it's like impressive, even if the experience leaves something to be desired. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think taking that idea and then mashing that up with yeah, the way that creative, I guess, filmmaking and TV and all these things have sort of trended towards infinite sequels and remakes and reboots and all of these things, legacy sequels. You said something before about it being, them doing that even if it's not what the story requires. And that really got me thinking that sometimes it's counter to the needs of story, right? Because stories kind of acquire their meaning when they end, like when you can look back and like sort of look at the story as a whole. But if it never ends, like what, like
Right.
what is, yeah,
What's it about?
yeah,
Yeah. And it ultimately, I think a lot of these, they just become about themselves, right? They're just about the experience of the franchise itself. And yeah. And I think in our larger culture, there's sort of this malaise about what what we're doing with a lot of different things. And it has a similar dynamic. It's like, what are we doing anything new? Or is this just, are we just retreading things indefinitely?
yeah. Absolutely. So I have a question about world building, which you do twice because you world build the Malakarn and the quote unquote real world of the people sort of behind this production. So first on your fantasy world, can you talk a little bit about like what went into building this fantasy world and building like a sort of fantasy franchise from the ground up, as it were?
Yeah, so you said it's called, this fantasy world is called the Malakarn. It's like the Middle Earth or the Westeros, right, of this franchise, which in the world of the book had been a series of novels and then movies and so on. What was kind of interesting was it's sort of intentionally very vanilla. It's like the kind of the most stereotypical quasi medieval European fantasy setting, and it intentionally so because this franchise has run out of steam and they're not really doing anything interesting. And so the challenge was to make a world that the world itself is not very interesting, but at least the characters could be. And so we get introduced to it through a character who is not a knight, he's not a king, he's just like a mason, he's just like a regular guy. Um, and there's this sense that things are sort of past their peak and things aren't as good as they used to be, and he joins a reenactors guild, of a wizarding reenactors guild. And it's just like it's kind of made me chuckle because it's like, right, we have these same sort of things in our world. And if you're living in a time where it kind of feels like the major events are in the past, the things that really mattered are over. What's left, and what's left is nostalgia. And that is, so that's really what it is a fantasy world that is itself just nostalgia.
Wow, that is fascinating. Yeah, I can absolutely see that. And then the way that that intersects with the story that you're telling in the real world. I love the time jumps, by the way. I probably should have laid this out a little bit more clearer, but you do sort of have, there's more than two perspectives for sure, but you have sort of dual timelines, like the Malakarn story and then the real world story that's about like the sort of the building of the franchise and everything going through history through like the rise of this like fantasy property. You are able to kind of chart like the progression of Hollywood and how it treats, I think, like adaptations and intellectual property and stuff like that. So can you talk a little bit about building out that real world and what some of the messages, you've already hinted at them, but some of your storytelling intentions with the sort of the Hollywood and the agents and all of that side of things?
Yeah. Yeah, it was um and you're right, the real world stuff kind of goes back in time a bit and then works forward in time. So it encompasses decades. Um and really it's thinking about, with a satirical lens to it, sure, but like how this has changed over the years and how it may continue to change. And so you go from uh a series of popular books to those books being turned into movies kind of against the author's wishes, and then those movies becoming this extended universe, and then eventually to the world of the story, the Malakarn fake world itself. So it's really just thinking about, a lot of times, like what, so much, right, so much of what we know about how movies are made is kind of silly, and there's like lots of stories about like extravagant Hollywood productions, and it's like, if we would just push this in the future a little bit and crank up the like unreality of it maybe a touch, like what would it look like? And that's how you get this situation in the book where it's just a little bit in the future, it's just a little bit extreme, but not too far. Like I've right? It's just enough that yeah, you kind of like push and like if you could do this, if this was possible, like what would it look like?
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting line that you kind of have to straddle with like sci-fi and dystopian like future storytelling is that it has to be like intelligible to our world or resemble it in some ways, but then also be like just distanced enough that like, it allows like a little bit of distance, I think, for the reader who can like then make the connections between like this imagined future and our own society and stuff like that. There's a lot of really interesting, I think, sort of line straddling like that this book does. In addition to like just having managing the multiple points of views and the timelines that jump back and forth. In terms of your writing, did you write the Malakarn and Hollywood stories together in dialogue, or did you write each thread separately and interweave them?
Yeah, that's actually a good question because they were separate because early drafts of this, it was much more linear in terms of the timeline. And that was changed after conversations with my editor that had more to do with kind of narrative propulsion than anything else. Because if it was purely linear, it takes the story a little bit longer to kind of get going. And so a lot of the stuff that happens chronologically later was written later and then kind of folded back once it got kind of reworked and reimagined. um yeah, I do have to consider how they are speaking to each other because there's a lot of stuff that there's kind of some fun dramatic irony and things that you end up knowing as a reader much earlier than the characters and whatnot that is fun to play with, but that wasn't initially how it was laid out. Mhm.
And that does actually allow the reader to sort of in some instances sort of recreate the experience of like a viewer of this show, right? Like
Yeah.
where you know things before they do. In terms of, I guess, creating your points of view, was there a voice or a character who, two-part question, who was the easiest or the most fun for you to capture on the page? And the flip side, was there one who was the most challenging?
Um, so Buck, who is the Mason character I mentioned earlier, was fun because he is what ha over the course of the book, many decades pass. So there's actually a whole generation of these characters that grow up in this world and think it's 100% real, and it is real to them, and he's one of them. And so yeah, he was a fun one as a way of getting a real point of view of a real, a person who doesn't really know anything that's going on. He's completely out of his depth, but those are always fun to write. Characters who maybe, think they know a lot more than they do, and they don't know anything, and he knows very, very little. But so that's a lot of fun. And in terms of difficult ones, I don't know if any of the characters were particularly difficult. There's a couple of characters that sort of intentionally don't get into their point of view or only briefly into their point of view, um, because, well, yeah, they're either that wasn't helping the story go forward or there wasn't a good reason for it. There was one character who is sort of the antagonist of the whole thing, who you don't get his point of view until very, very late in the book. And it's sort of hidden what's going on, and you kind of see it from the outside what's happening to him. But once you get into his head, it's revealing. I'll say that.
Yeah, it is. Oh gosh. Yeah, it's really hard to sort of frame some of these questions without spoiling the ride for the reader. This
Yeah,
particular next one is sort of, I'm going to let you kind of take it where you would like to, but I'm always really interested in how writers approach endings. And this isn't about the content of the ending so much as about like your writing process. But did you know when you started out writing how things would end, or did you kind of find it along the way? I'm really kind of curious like I'm always curious about how like the writing process itself often like transforms the thing that you're setting out to write?
sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I do know where I'm going. It's hard for me to not write with some kind of destination. Um, I outline and then I work with that. I try not to keep anything too frozen once it's outlined. Like if it needs to change, it needs to change, including the ending if it has to be adapted. But I do know where I'm headed just because that does help shape the rest of it. And in this case, there's, so many characters and points of view, and they all come together at the end. And so it was important, really important to keep in mind always kind of where the train was heading, so to speak, so that everything could get lined up correctly.
Mm. Yeah, I never actually really thought about that when you have when you're juggling this many perspectives and timelines and all that, you probably have to have a pretty tight hold on the reins of like where the whole thing is going at any given time.
Yeah.
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 Um, so let's see. My last question. So I guess like my last question is about what you've already hinted at a little bit, but the ways in which the worlds mirror each other and are sometimes in dialogue and sometimes create like a lot of really interesting moments of dramatic irony and so on. Um, in that juxtaposition, I guess even if you take out the sort of like let me reframe this part of the question. I'm sorry. So like late on a Friday and my brain is sort of like starting to shut down a little
Sure.
bit. But I'm always really driven or interested in like juxtapositions between the medieval or the medievalish and the modern. I was
Mm.
a medieval historian before I was a librarian, and so that's also like one of the things that always that draws me to.
I was also a medieval studies major in
No
college, so.
way. Oh, that's great. So I'm always really, I think that like comparing the modern world to the medieval world is always really productive because like the medieval world is always a little bit more modern than we tend to think it is, and we are also a little bit more medieval than I think we are comfortable thinking. So yeah, like was that a productive juxtaposition for you or something that you kind of thought about too?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that the medieval world of the book isn't real and isn't medieval even by the standards of the people who constructed it. It is a imagining of a medieval world, and so it actually brings in a lot of modern assumptions, I think, about how
Mm.
things worked and how they should work, and um, which is true of a lot of fantasy stories, I think, in the modern era that maybe aren't based on a real, reality of what the Middle Ages and European Middle Ages might have been like, but on sort of a, post-romantic conception of that. So, the particular ways like class may be structured or something, or in the world reflects that maybe more than how those things may have actually worked and whatnot. And so yeah, it's so like I said, I wasn't trying to build a realistic medieval world because the people who were writing this in the world of the book also were not constructing a realistic medieval world. And so what is that actually like? But um there's a lot of, characters have discussions about what they think should be more realistic, and it gets all mixed up because yeah, they're not none of these people are actually experts in or from yeah, a real version of this.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like Ren Fair medievalism, where it's like
it is. Yeah,
it's
sure.
vibes based.
It is.
And
It is. It is vibes based. Yeah, and they end up making a lot of decisions in the book about things that are really about story and about aesthetics, and not historical. Yeah, based on what they want it to look like or whatever.
absolutely. And on the flip side, I feel like, if something that I wrote like in my little marginal notes was that like if IP were like plots of land, then like Hollywood is feudalism. Like it's like these are kingdoms based on like their possession of IPs and
Sure. Yeah,
franchises and stuff. So
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting, food for thought in here. And also like the story is a really fun ride too. And yeah, it's been like a blast to read and to talk to you about. What is on your horizon? I know that you are probably deep in promoting this right now, but are you writing or are there more novels in your future?
There is a novel that will be out next spring, also from Tor, that more to come on that soon. And yeah, I'm still writing and promoting, and looking forward to people being able to read the book.
Nice. I am too. I'm very excited to put this in people's hands at the library here. So thank you again for taking the time to chat with us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Listeners, please check out the franchise. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for your books. All right, everyone, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.